Have you heard what happened to King Charles? No, not the official palace press release. Not the glossy, polished headlines or the smiling photo ops from months ago. I'm talking about the moment everything behind the gilded gates changed. Quietly, suddenly, and devastatingly. Because what's unraveling inside Buckingham Palace right now, it's far more tragic and urgent than most people realize. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Let's begin with a simple but haunting question. What happens when the most carefully preserved institution in the world is shaken by something no amount of protocol, power, or pageantry can fix? That's not a hypothetical anymore. That's the story of King Charles III and the devastating news that may forever alter the British monarchy as we know it. It started subtly, almost unnoticeably. A cancelled appearance here, a missed handshake there. The king, once praised for his tireless work ethic and legendary iron schedule, began withdrawing from public view, first in whispers, then in headlines. Routine checkup. Nothing to worry about. Just a precaution. But if you followed the royals long enough, you know one thing for certain. When the palace says it's nothing, that's when you really start paying attention. Behind the closed doors of Windsor and Clarence House, something was wrong. Gravely wrong. The kind of wrong that sends staffers into emergency meetings and triggers late-night calls between royal doctors and trusted aides. It wasn't just illness. It was the nature of the illness. Something elusive, lingering, and, as whispered by a close courtier, possibly incurable. And yet, no official word. Because how do you tell the world that the newly crowned king, a man who waited more than 70 years to wear the crown, may be facing the very battle no monarch ever wants to fight? The battle against time. The battle against the body. The battle against a diagnosis that doctors, behind palace curtains, had only one word for. Irreversible. Now pause with me for a moment. Imagine you're Charles. You've spent your entire life in preparation. Every gesture rehearsed. Every opinion monitored. Every ambition folded behind duty. And just as the world finally acknowledges your reign, just as you're stepping into the role long denied, you're told your reign might be cut short, not by scandal, not by abdication, but by biology. How do you process that? How do you protect the monarchy while crumbling inside? How do you tell your family, your country, your legacy? But it gets darker. Because as the truth slowly leaked through the marble halls, as whispers morphed into undeniables, another tension began brewing. One the palace could no longer contain. It wasn't just Charles's health on the line. It was the future of the monarchy itself. Would William step up early? Would Camilla seize control behind the scenes? And what about Harry, left across the Atlantic, blindsided, enraged, excluded once again? The royal family, always balancing tradition with image, now faced a crisis where both were in danger of collapsing. And the public? Hungry for answers. Flooding forums, hashtags, tabloid covers. Because no matter how hard they tried to contain it, one terrifying word began echoing louder than the rest. Cancer. Of course, the palace didn't confirm. Not directly. They never do. They talked about treatment plans. They thanked the public for understanding. They mentioned resilience and faith. But the details? Sealed. The prognosis? Unspoken. And the emotional weight? Unbearable. Now here's where it gets even more complex. Because this isn't just a medical story. It's a constitutional one. It's dynastic. It's emotional, historical, political, and deeply personal. For Charles. For Camilla. For William and Kate. And yes, for Harry, especially Harry. Because what if? And it's a question many are now daring to ask. What if the king's health is worse than anyone has been told? And what if some within the palace already knew? Let's zoom out. Historically, royal health has always been a tightly guarded secret. King George VI's lung cancer? Hidden. The Queen Mother's surgeries? Buried in coded language. Even Queen Elizabeth II's final months were shrouded in mystery, until it was too late to disguise the truth. So ask yourself, what aren't we being told now? What's happening in the corridors of power, behind the Queen's sudden increase in solo appearances, behind Prince William's abrupt travel cancellations, behind the unusually emotional tone of recent speeches? Coincidence? Or is this the carefully managed prelude to something seismic? The signs are everywhere if you know where to look. The palace's growing reliance on soft appearances, photos of Charles reading in a study, smiling faintly during Zoom calls, waving briefly from a car. No speeches, no state visits, no walkabouts. Meanwhile, sources report a tightening of the inner circle. Longtime staffers quietly retired. Medical experts brought in under NDAs. And that phrase again, no cure, whispered with an urgency that chills the room. But the most alarming shift? The succession apparatus is already moving. And let's not forget public perception. Support for the monarchy has always hinged on continuity. But what happens when continuity is broken? When the figurehead, whose image is printed on every coin, stamped on every government document, starts fading? People notice. They speculate. They panic. Even within the palace, contingency plans are quietly debated. Will there be a regency? Will Charles step back formally if his condition worsens? Or will the firm attempt to maintain the illusion of strength until they can't? But it's not just about policy. It's about people. There are emotions in this story, deep, raw, contradictory ones. Charles isn't just a monarch. He's a father, a husband, a man who, despite controversy, has always clung to duty. Now he's facing a reality where that very duty might be the thing killing him. Stress, fatigue, endless scrutiny. And yet, he keeps going. But at what cost? And more importantly, for how much longer? Here's what you won't hear in most coverage. This isn't just a royal health scare. It's a reckoning. Because the crown doesn't have the luxury of fragility. The world sees the monarchy as eternal. But what if it's not? What if this moment, this illness, this quiet, devastating spiral, is the beginning of the end of the old monarchy? And what if Charles knows it? We are going to take you through every detail. The leaks, the cover-ups, the palace maneuvering. You'll see how Camilla responded, how William made a shocking decision, how Harry, left out of the loop, launched his own response, and how a forgotten letter from Diana could unravel everything. We'll look at the public shift, the media frenzy, the public grief, the parliament debates, and the ultimate question no one dares ask aloud. Can a king die before his reign even begins? But first, let's rewind to the day it all began. Because on that cold January morning, as the world went about its business, a devastating truth landed inside Buckingham Palace. And the first sign was chilling. Silence. Not the usual ceremonial quiet, but the kind of silence that says, something's wrong. Very wrong. And what happened next would tear through the royal family like a thunderclap. Because the truth about King Charles's illness was no longer containable. Have you ever felt a chill before a storm even begins? That eerie moment when the world seems to hold its breath, when something shifts, but you can't quite name it? That's exactly what happened at Buckingham Palace one cold, gray morning, just after dawn. And it all began with a cancellation. A single line sent from a secured palace server to royal correspondents. Due to unforeseen circumstances, His Majesty will no longer attend today's engagement. We appreciate your understanding. No explanation. No reschedule. No photo of the king waving from a window or smiling through the glass. Just silence. And for those who know how the royal machine works, that was the first clue something was off. Very off. Because here's the thing. The palace doesn't do unforeseen. Every royal outing is planned with military precision, down to the minute. From the scent of the room to the route of the car. From the number of press badges issued to the color of the king's tie. So when a last-minute cancellation comes through, especially involving the sovereign, it sets off quiet alarms. And this time, those alarms weren't just quiet. They were deafening. Within hours, whispers began circulating among press insiders. The phrase health concern was thrown around. Then, private matter. But by lunchtime, the whispers had grown into urgent questions. Where was King Charles? And more pressingly, why wasn't anyone answering? Behind the gates of Buckingham Palace, staffers were already scrambling. Sources later revealed that a senior footman was seen leaving the king's wing in visible distress. One even said he looked as though he'd just witnessed a ghost. But let's rewind just slightly. The night before this sudden cancellation, something unsettling had occurred. King Charles, after attending a small dinner with close advisors, reportedly retired early. Nothing too out of the ordinary, except one detail. He requested no one disturb him, not even Camilla. And when his valet came to check on him at sunrise, routine protocol, The king's bedroom door remained shut. Locked. Not bolted. Not barricaded. Just shut tight. Now pause and imagine that. The King of England, head of state, supreme governor of the church, the face on your currency, not answering the door. Even the most private monarchs maintain a rhythm, a signal, a nod, a gesture that all is well. But that morning, nothing. Eventually, a doctor was summoned. Then a second. Then Camilla. What unfolded behind that door remains a matter of strict secrecy. But according to one source, an insider with ties to the king's private staff, what they discovered left the queen consort visibly shaken. No collapse. No drama. Just a man, sitting in stillness, staring into the fire, silent. And next to him, a document. A test result. The kind no one ever wants to receive. That's when the tone shifted. Within an hour, Charles's private secretary activated what's known internally as Tier 4 contingency mode. Few people outside the firm know what that means. But here's what we've learned. Tier 4 is the royal equivalent of an emergency lockdown, not for national threats, but internal ones. Medical, psychological, reputational. In this case, all three. Downstairs, staff phones were confiscated. Aides were instructed to clear schedules for the next 72 hours. Camilla was ushered into her private quarters. Charles was moved to a private medical suite within the palace. And perhaps most chillingly, the entire west wing of Buckingham Palace was sealed. Just let that sink in. Sealed. No visitors. No photographers. No family. Even William was reportedly informed after the fact, and only by encrypted message. Why? Because what Charles had learned that morning was devastating. And the palace's first instinct? Contain it. Now let's talk about what we do know. Multiple sources, medical insiders, and former royal protection officers have confirmed that a series of tests had been conducted weeks prior. These weren't routine wellness checks. These were specific, targeted, a result of persistent fatigue, intermittent vision loss, and neurological symptoms that had been quietly troubling the king for months. And then came the report, one that pointed toward a neurodegenerative condition. Slowly progressing, currently untreatable, and potentially irreversible. That's when everything stopped. Not just Charles's calendar, but his ability to act, to speak clearly, to lead. For the first time, the man who trained his entire life for the throne hesitated. And the palace? It went completely, terrifyingly, silent. Now ask yourself, why hide this? Why not address the nation, reassure the public, manage expectations? Because the truth is, the monarchy doesn't just represent tradition. It represents stability. And if the world sees its king as weakened, the institution itself begins to fracture. Internally, there was panic. One senior aide reportedly burst into tears. Another resigned on the spot. And while Charles remained calm, observers say there was something different in his eyes that day. Not fear, not sorrow, but resignation. As if he already knew this day would come. Meanwhile, the outside world noticed something else. BBC correspondents were unusually subdued during that evening's royal segment. Sky News repeated the phrase, unavailable due to personal matters, 7 times in 1 hour. And on Twitter, the hashtags #WhereIsCharles and #BuckinghamSilence began trending. Public speculation ranged from a mild infection to an international hostage crisis. But behind every theory was one common emotion: dread. And for good reason. Because as day turned to night, and no word came from the palace, the silence only deepened. Even Camilla, known for her resilience, reportedly refused to speak with press advisors. She looked like she'd aged 10 years overnight, one palace insider later confessed. And then, something even more unexpected happened. At precisely 10:14 p.m., the palace lights flickered. Not metaphorically, literally. Emergency lighting activated across the West Wing. Security doubled. Was it a power failure? A test? Or a signal? We still don't know. But that was the moment royal protection officers were seen escorting 3 private physicians into the side entrance. Escorted, not driven. Why walk? Because no noise. No camera flashes. No attention. Just controlled silence. And in that silence, the future of the monarchy hung in the balance. Now, think back to that document. The test result left beside Charles's chair. What did it say? What name was scribbled at the top? We can't say for certain. but sources claim it bore a title many hoped would never reach a royal. Corticobasal degeneration, a rare, cruel neurological disease. No cure, limited treatment, and most heartbreaking of all, it affects cognition, motor skills, speech, the very tools a monarch needs. But if you think that's where the story ends, think again. Because the next day, when Charles finally emerged from his private suite, he wasn't alone. Standing beside him, pale, composed, unreadable, was Camilla. No cameras, no press. But one photograph, leaked by an insider, showed something chilling. A single tear rolling down her cheek. And Charles, stone-faced, determined, and holding a letter addressed to William. What was in that letter? Why was William the first person outside the palace to receive it? And why, after reading it, did William cancel 3 engagements and retreat to Sandringham without Kate? That's where our next chapter begins. Because the king may have gone silent. But the heir? He was about to erupt. What if the most powerful man in Britain looked you in the eyes and couldn't remember your name? What if he faltered mid-sentence, forgot why he walked into a room, or worse, stood before an entire nation and couldn't finish his speech? That's the nightmare scenario now whispered across royal corridors. And the terrifying truth? It might already be happening. Because behind that sealed palace door, beyond the photo ops, formal dinners, and constitutional duties, King Charles received a diagnosis no monarch wants to hear. Not because of the fear, not even because of the pain, but because of what it means. For him, for his reign, for the crown. Let's rewind to the moment it began unraveling. After weeks of subtle symptoms, dizziness, stiffness, tremors, lost words, the king's private medical team escalated concerns. Originally dismissed as stress, the symptoms persisted, became harder to explain, and began interfering with daily briefings and speech rehearsals. At first, Charles brushed it off. He was known for his resilience. A man who'd endured decades of criticism, tabloid smears, and public scrutiny. Surely this was just another storm to weather? But his aides knew better. He was forgetting things. Small things, at first. A name, a scheduled event, a misplaced paper. Then came the tremors, the stiffness, a dragging foot on stairs. And then, on a quiet morning in early January, Charles lost his balance walking from the private garden to his study. No press saw it. No statement was made. But that fall, that was the final red flag. Within 48 hours, a team of top neurologists were brought in under strict non-disclosure. Blood work, brain scans, cognitive tests, and days later, the answer came. A rare neurological condition, corticobasal degeneration, or CBD, an incurable disorder that progressively affects movement, memory, and speech. For most people, it's devastating. For a king, it's an earthquake. Let's be clear, CBD isn't widely understood by the public. It's often misdiagnosed as Parkinson's or Alzheimer's early on. It begins subtly, slowed speech, stiff limbs, personality changes. But over time, it robs a person of their most basic abilities. One doctor, speaking anonymously, said this: CBD is like watching a mind unravel from the inside, while the body follows. And the worst part? There's no real way to stop it. The royal doctors knew what they were seeing. They'd seen similar signs in other senior royals, but never this early, and never in a reigning monarch. And so the question became, do we tell him? The answer came from Charles himself. He demanded honesty. He always had, despite being born into a world that thrived on deception, spin, and image management. And when the words were finally spoken, corticobasal degeneration, he didn't flinch. He nodded once, then asked for time. What followed was a silence thicker than any royal protocol. Camilla was brought in. Only her. Not William. Not Anne. Not Edward. And certainly not Harry. She sat across from him, reportedly holding his hand, saying nothing. Just tears. Just time. And then planning. Because when you're the monarch, even tragedy must be managed like a chess game. Here's what most people still don't realize. This wasn't just a personal health blow. This was a constitutional crisis in the making. The British monarchy, built on image, legacy, and projection, cannot afford vulnerability. Every appearance, every speech, every step, they all signal continuity. So a king with a degenerative illness? That shakes the very foundation. Immediately, conversations began about regency laws. about temporary power-sharing structures, about the possibility of an early abdication, something unthinkable just a year ago. But Charles? He resisted, because to him, stepping back meant admitting weakness. And after waiting 70 years in the wings, he wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. Now let's talk about the letter. The one Charles wrote the day after his diagnosis. Addressed to William. Short, direct, handwritten in his private study, with only Camilla present. Sources say it didn't begin with "my dear son" or "to the Prince of Wales." It began with, "If you're reading this, I've decided to tell you the truth." The letter reportedly outlined his condition, his prognosis, and, most notably, his wishes. He didn't want sympathy. He didn't want media leaks. He didn't even want a change in public routine, at least not yet. What he did want? Time. To speak to his people on his terms. To serve, as long as he could. And to protect the institution from unraveling. But William? He wasn't convinced. When he received the letter, insiders say he turned pale and immediately canceled upcoming engagements. He didn't go home. He went straight to Sandringham. Alone. Kate stayed behind with the children. There, away from press, away from the London chaos, he met privately with key advisors, men and women loyal to him, not the king. And that's when the first whispers began of a transition strategy. A roadmap, not for now, but for soon. Because while Charles clung to hope, William, ever the realist, knew what was coming. And he wasn't willing to let the monarchy stumble unprepared. But here's where it gets even messier. Because while William was quietly mobilizing, someone else learned the truth. Not from Charles, not from the palace, from a leak. And that someone, Prince Harry. Thousands of miles away, in Montecito, Harry was blindsided. He reportedly received a call from a mutual friend, possibly one of Diana's former staffers, who had access to high-level chatter in London. The words were vague, but the meaning was clear. Something is seriously wrong with your father. Harry, already estranged, was left humiliated. He hadn't been told. He hadn't been consulted. He hadn't even been considered. Now pause and ask yourself, how would you feel, regardless of your past, your mistakes, your exile, to hear that your father, the man you still call Pa, is battling a degenerative illness, and no one told you? That kind of emotional gut punch triggers something deeper than anger. It triggers action. And Harry, according to insiders, made a call to the palace. Direct. Unfiltered. To Camilla. What happened on that call? What was said? That's where the story takes a darker turn. Because the call wasn't warm. It wasn't conciliatory. It was confrontational. Harry allegedly demanded answers. Why he wasn't told, who made the decision to shut him out, and whether Charles even wanted him to know. And Camilla? She didn't hold back. According to one account, she told him, "This isn't about you, Harry. This is about protecting the crown." That line, insiders say, set Harry off. He ended the call abruptly. And hours later, he contacted his team in Los Angeles with a single order. Prepare a statement. Now we don't know exactly what that statement was meant to say, because it was never released. Why? Because just as Harry was drafting it, the palace moved first. A brief, one-paragraph update was released to the press. His Majesty the King recently underwent medical evaluation for a benign condition. He is in good spirits and will continue with select engagements as advised. No mention of CBD. No mention of future plans. Just enough to calm speculation, but vague enough to invite doubt. It was damage control. Classic royal PR. But to those who knew better, it was the start of a larger cover-up. And here's the most chilling part. Even now, as you're watching this, the palace still hasn't confirmed the full truth. But the signs are mounting. Cancelled events. Shorter appearances. A trembling hand during a recent speech. The Queen quietly taking on more duties. And Charles? He's retreating. Still smiling. Still waving. But increasingly distant. As if he's preparing for something. Something final. So here's the question that haunts everyone in the royal orbit. How long can they keep this hidden? Because the diagnosis is real. The symptoms are worsening. And the world is watching. But what comes next? That will determine the future of the monarchy. Because Charles isn't the only one with decisions to make. William's preparing. Camilla's calculating. And Harry? He's about to make a move that could change everything. What happens when the heir to the throne stops waiting and starts demanding? Because make no mistake, Prince William has always played the long game. Disciplined, silent, loyal. But when he read that letter from his father, when he discovered the truth about Charles's diagnosis, something in him shifted. And what came next? It wasn't diplomacy. It wasn't deferential. It was an ultimatum. A bold, heart-wrenching, and calculated move that stunned the palace and exposed a crack in the very foundation of the monarchy. Let's break it down. First, William didn't respond immediately to the letter. Not out of disrespect, but out of shock. He sat with it, reread it, then reread it again. By his third reading, he'd stopped looking at the words and started thinking about their consequences. Because this wasn't just his father's burden. It was his future being thrust forward, prematurely, painfully, and without warning. The Prince of Wales had been preparing his entire life to one day become king. But not like this. Not in shadow. Not under a cloud of neurological decline. Not with his father silently fading before the nation's eyes. And certainly not while the palace PR machine tried to sweep the truth under the rug. So William made a decision. He requested a private audience with his father. Not over the phone. Not via letter. In person. He would confront him face to face. And what unfolded at Clarence House that evening changed everything. Now here's where things get tense. Because when William arrived, unannounced, unaccompanied, unguarded, Charles was in his private study. Camilla greeted him, reportedly stiff and cool. She knew why he was there. She knew what was coming. William entered the study alone and shut the door. What happened inside remains classified, but leaks from multiple insiders paint a vivid picture. The conversation began with quiet concern. Father and son. No titles. No formality. William asked questions. Charles answered. Then the tone changed. William asked the real question. How long have you known? A pause. Then Charles admitted, weeks. Maybe longer. He'd suspected it for months, but didn't want to alarm anyone. Not the public, and especially not William. And that's when William snapped. According to sources close to the prince, he raised his voice. Not in disrespect, but in heartbreak. You should have told me. You should have told us all. Because in William's eyes, this wasn't about secrecy. It was about responsibility. The monarchy isn't just a family. It's an institution, an inheritance, a delicate balance of public trust and private duty. And if Charles was ill, truly, deeply ill, then contingency plans weren't just advisable. They were urgent. But Charles, ever the stoic, pushed back. He insisted he was still capable, that he could manage, that stepping back now would destabilize the firm. He even used the phrase, I waited my whole life for this. I won't give it up now. And that's when William issued the ultimatum. He stood, reportedly shaking with emotion, and said the words that would echo across royal circles for weeks. Then I will. Those 3 words stunned the king. William went on. If you won't start the transition process, if you won't tell the public, then I will take it upon myself to protect the monarchy. He didn't threaten a rebellion. He didn't suggest abdication. He offered a compromise, a phased transition, an honest press statement, a plan to introduce William and Kate as acting royals in increasing capacity, all to preserve stability, all to protect Charles's legacy while he still had control over it. But Charles, caught between pride and protocol, refused. He believed public knowledge of his condition would trigger panic, press hysteria, and political chaos. And in that refusal, he drew a line. So William did too. When he left Clarence House that night, he was quiet, composed. But make no mistake, he had already started laying the groundwork. The next day, he called an emergency meeting at Kensington Palace. Only a handful of aides were allowed in, those he trusted implicitly, and what they discussed was nothing short of extraordinary. A new schedule, revised public duties, travel plans temporarily suspended. Kate was informed and stood firmly by his side. Because they both knew, if Charles wouldn't initiate the handover of power, they would prepare for the moment the country demanded it. Not in rebellion, not in disrespect, but out of love, for the crown, for the country, and for a father who was still pretending nothing had changed. Now let's pause for a moment. Can you imagine the emotional contradiction William was living through? He wasn't just a son losing his father to a slow, cruel disease. He was a future king, being forced to watch the throne wobble in real time. He didn't want to take it early. He didn't want to steal the crown. He just didn't want to see the public lose faith. And so, with that one meeting, one that Charles would later call unfortunate but necessary, William changed course. But it gets even more complicated. Because someone else heard about the confrontation, Camilla, and she was furious. Sources say she viewed William's push as premature, and, privately, even called it a power grab. But was that fair? Or was it projection? Because here's where the internal royal politics get messy. Camilla had quietly started building her own circle of influence behind the scenes. Since Charles's diagnosis, she had been meeting with senior advisors, many of whom had nothing to do with William. She was crafting a fallback plan, not just to support Charles, but to ensure her role, her relevance, and her power remained untouched. In her eyes, William wasn't preparing the monarchy. He was threatening her place in it. And this tension only grew stronger when William made a subtle but bold public move. At a charity gala that same week, he stepped onto the stage, took the mic, and delivered a speech that, while brief, made headlines across the country. Not because of what he said, but because of what he didn't say. He referred to a time of transition. He spoke of duty in the face of uncertainty. And most tellingly, he didn't mention his father once. That omission was intentional, and every royal correspondent picked up on it. The press began speculating. Is William preparing to take over? Why has Charles disappeared from sight? Where is the Queen? And perhaps most urgently, what are they hiding? Back inside the palace, phones rang nonstop. MPs began requesting briefings. Royal staffers leaked conflicting stories. And then, something unprecedented happened. A member of Parliament, a senior figure aligned with the Conservative Party, called for clarity on the King's health in the House of Commons. That had never happened before, not even when Queen Elizabeth II fell ill. And it proved one thing. William's ultimatum had worked. The world was paying attention. But at what cost? Because while William believed he was saving the monarchy, Charles felt something else. Betrayal. He reportedly told one advisor, "I expected Harry to attack me, but not William." Those words reveal the depth of hurt, not just political, but personal. Because at the heart of this drama isn't just a power struggle. It's a family, a father, a son, two men with the same destiny, but a widening gulf between them. And as Charles withdrew further from the public eye, and William stepped more boldly into it, another threat emerged, one no one had accounted for, one that wasn't in the line of succession, one that was watching from afar and ready to strike. Prince Harry. What happens when the Queen Consort becomes the de facto ruler? What happens when a woman who was once publicly scorned quietly takes the reins of a monarchy in crisis? Because while the world watched King Charles's health deteriorate and Prince William assert himself with an ultimatum, someone else was moving with far more subtlety and far more strategy. Queen Camilla. And what she did next. It wasn't just protective. It was calculated. She formed what palace insiders would later whisper about in hushed tones, the secret council. And no one, not even Charles, knew just how deep her network had become. Let's go back. In the days following William's confrontation with his father, Clarence House fell into a strange kind of limbo. Charles had returned to a low-visibility routine, limited engagements, closely monitored media appearances, heavily redacted press statements. Camilla, however, remained active, unusually active. She was seen leaving meetings early in the morning and arriving late to scheduled events. She made calls behind closed doors, untraceable, unlogged. She requested private appointments with advisors once loyal to Queen Elizabeth herself. To the public, she smiled. To the press, she waved. But behind the scenes, she was building a war room. Now let's be clear. Camilla has always been underestimated. When she first emerged as Charles's partner in the public eye, the tabloids painted her as a homewrecker, a shadowy figure behind Diana's tears. But over the years, she transformed her image with shrewdness, charm, and relentless patience. She became Queen Consort not through popularity, but through positioning. And now, with Charles's health declining and William pushing forward, Camilla saw what others missed. A power vacuum. And history shows us something chilling. Power vacuums in monarchies are never left unfilled. They're seized. So what exactly was this secret council? According to multiple sources, some now speaking off the record, it consisted of 7 core individuals. Handpicked, trusted, each with a unique role in keeping Camilla's hand on the wheel as Charles faded from view. Sir Alan Bradsley, former communications director under Queen Elizabeth, retired officially, but still very much in play. Dame Eleanor Hawthorne, a legal expert on constitutional law, brought in to review succession procedures discreetly. Dr. Francis Welby, a neurologist with ties to royal medical staff, confidential advisor on Charles's condition. Lord Mark Glenferrie, a PR strategist with international crisis management experience. Lady Isabel Strathmore, a longtime aristocratic ally with deep connections in both Parliament and the British press. Colonel Rupert Kingsley, security liaison, ensures movement within royal properties remains controlled. Martin Colville, the wildcard, a tech specialist involved in digital reputation monitoring, formerly with MI5. These weren't casual consultants. They were hand-selected architects of a new royal communications blueprint, one that operated parallel to the formal crown structures. And their mission? Preserve Charles's image, reinforce Camilla's presence, control the narrative, and if necessary, neutralize dissent. What does that mean in real terms? It means Camilla wasn't just standing by her husband. She was protecting the throne and possibly preparing to occupy it in all but name. It started subtly. An uptick in solo appearances, soft focus interviews, public engagement with women's charities and health campaigns, carefully chosen to evoke compassion and trust. Suddenly, royal photographers found her everywhere. At schools, at hospices, even delivering brief addresses. Something she had rarely done before. All carefully staged to craft an image. Camilla, the steady hand. Camilla, the unwavering consort. Camilla, the face of continuity. And behind the scenes, she began circulating a dangerous phrase among advisors. Interim authority. What did that mean? According to insiders, it was Camilla's proposal to establish a temporary structure wherein she would act as custodian of royal duties, while Charles managed his health. On paper, that sounds noble, protective, sensible, but it bypassed one key player, William. Because William's plan for a phased transition with Kate as his partner, Camilla had no intention of letting that overshadow her influence. She wasn't just keeping the throne warm. She was quietly reinforcing her grip. And it all came to a head during a now infamous private dinner. It was a Wednesday night at Highgrove, a seemingly ordinary evening. Until Camilla convened 4 of her council members for what appeared to be a casual meal. But the menu wasn't the focus. It was the document presented during dessert, a 12-page dossier titled, Preserving the Crown, Strategic Duties for QC. QC, of course, meaning Queen Consort. In it were proposed adjustments to public engagements, media briefings, and, most alarmingly, a section outlining protocols for leadership messaging in the king's absence. Translation? Camilla wanted to begin speaking on Charles's behalf, not just at charity events, but potentially to the nation. Now ask yourself, who gave her that authority? The king hadn't publicly endorsed such a plan. Parliament hadn't been briefed. William certainly hadn't agreed. So who was driving this? The answer? Camilla herself. With the blessing of a carefully curated inner circle and a media landscape increasingly thirsty for clear royal direction. But here's where the twist comes in. While Camilla was building her council, she was also keeping secrets, including from Charles. Multiple reports suggest that he was not fully informed about the scope of her strategic meetings. In fact, according to one palace aide, when Charles learned that Camilla had begun crafting potential regency scenarios without his input, he was livid. "You presume I'm already gone," he allegedly said. A heartbreaking statement, not just because of the words, but because of what they implied. Charles was no longer in control, not of the press, not of the palace, and perhaps not even of his own wife. And it gets darker, because while Camilla was preparing her version of stability, another source of chaos was brewing. A phone call was intercepted. A conversation between a member of Camilla's council and a senior editor at one of the UK's largest newspapers. The topic? William's unilateral overreach. The implication? Camilla's team was considering a strategic leak to undermine the Prince of Wales, casting him as power-hungry and emotionally reactive. But the leak never went out. Why? Because the editor, loyal to William after years of media cooperation, warned him. And that changed everything. William now knew that Camilla was maneuvering behind closed doors, that she was building her own sphere of influence, that she had cut him out, that she might even be preparing to challenge his roadmap for the monarchy. And that knowledge? It ignited something in him. Not vengeance, but a strategy. Because while Camilla was playing palace chess behind velvet curtains, William was about to make a very public move, one that would bypass the courtiers, bypass the gossip, and hit straight at the heart of the monarchy's most volatile fault line. Harry. Because as it turned out, Harry wasn't waiting quietly in California. He had been making plans of his own, and what happened next would send shockwaves through 2 continents and 3 royal households. What do you do when the people who once called you family now treat you like a ghost? What happens when you're the son of a dying king and the last to know? For Prince Harry, the answer came in a wave of betrayal. And once it hit, there was no turning back. Because while the palace managed Charles's condition with a tight lid and a rehearsed smile, they forgot one thing. You can't silence grief. And you definitely can't ignore Harry. He wasn't just angry. He was wounded, enraged, and ready to explode. And what followed was a storm of transatlantic fury, media mayhem, and one chilling declaration. They want to erase me. Let's unpack how he got there. Harry first heard of his father's illness not from the palace, not from his brother, not even from Charles himself, but through a friend. Not just any friend. Someone deeply connected to the old guard. A former royal aide turned West Coast contact, who had grown disillusioned with the firm's code of silence. The message was simple, terrifying, and vague. Something's going on. It's serious. They're not telling you. At first, Harry didn't believe it. He'd heard rumors before. Whispers of Charles feeling tired, canceling trips, skipping functions. But this? The urgency in that call, the crack in the voice? It wasn't gossip. It was a warning. And within hours, Harry was on the phone, calling Kensington Palace, Clarence House, even old security details. No one picked up. Or if they did, they passed the call, delayed it, dodged. One reply came via email. His Majesty is currently unavailable. We will respond at the earliest convenience. Convenience? That's what they offered a son desperate for answers? That's when Harry snapped. Let's pause and get inside his head for a moment. Imagine being thousands of miles away, alienated, excluded, and watching the institution you were born into, with all its pomp and power, fall apart in real time, while pretending it's fine. Now add a layer of family pain. A father he'd tried to reconnect with after the Queen's funeral. A brother he once called his best mate. A stepmother he still didn't trust. And now silence. Not the diplomatic kind. The kind that hurts. Harry turned to Meghan. She tried to keep him grounded. Told him not to jump to conclusions. Urged him to wait for confirmation. But even she saw it coming. The canceled appearances. The shift in tone. The vague statements from royal aides. Something was happening. And they weren't being told. So Harry did what he always does when backed into a corner. He went rogue. That same week, he picked up the phone and called Camilla directly. It was the first direct contact they'd had in nearly a year. The call lasted 7 minutes. The tension? Nuclear. Insiders say the conversation began with a simple question. Why didn't anyone tell me? Camilla's answer, according to one source, was brutal in its coldness. Because there's nothing you could have done. Translation? You're not part of this family anymore. And that burned. But it didn't silence him. It ignited him. That same night, Harry contacted his legal and media teams. He wanted to release a statement. An open letter. He planned to express concern, love, support, and frustration. But his advisors urged caution. They knew what he didn't. The press was already circling. And any move Harry made would be spun as self-serving. So Harry changed tactics. He wouldn't release a letter. He'd release a story. Here's what happened next. Within 48 hours, a senior producer from one of America's biggest talk shows received a confidential briefing. Harry is willing to talk, but only if it's about family, and only if it's unfiltered. It wasn't Oprah. It wasn't a big set piece. It was a whisper, testing the waters. Word spread quickly. Journalists sharpened their pens. Paparazzi scrambled. And royal correspondents in the UK held their breath. Was Harry about to blow the lid off the palace's darkest secret? The answer? Almost. But just as plans began forming, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived in Montecito, sealed with a royal crest. No return address. No official courier. Inside, one page, written in Charles's own hand. It simply read, Harry, I am not well, but I am still your father. Let us not make a spectacle of goodbye. If the time comes, you'll know. Until then, silence protects more than it betrays. Pa. That letter stopped Harry cold. Because for all the rage, all the hurt, all the tension, he still loved the man who signed that page. The man who walked Meghan down the aisle. The man who cradled him at Diana's funeral. The man who, despite everything, was still Pa. But grief doesn't cancel betrayal, and silence doesn't erase wounds. Harry now stood at a crossroads. Speak up and risk being painted as the prodigal son exploiting a tragedy, or stay quiet and be remembered as the one who abandoned the throne in its darkest hour? Either way, his name would be dragged, his motives questioned, his loyalty shattered again. And then came the documentary call. Netflix executives, already planning a follow-up to the Sussexes' earlier docuseries, reached out with a provocative offer. Tell the story, not for headlines, for history. Harry paused. The temptation was real, but the timing? Dangerous. So he asked for something else. Not an expose, not an attack, something subtler. A visual archive, private footage, home videos, Diana's letters, childhood moments with Charles. A living scrapbook of a father-son bond, crumbling in real time. Netflix agreed. Quietly, the project was greenlit, and its working title? The Heir and the Exit. Meanwhile, the palace caught wind, not of the documentary, but of the brewing PR storm. Because the press did notice Harry's calls, the unfiled statements, the meetings with LA lawyers. And suddenly, headlines began to shift. Harry blindsided by father's illness. Sources say Prince was kept in the dark about Charles's condition. Camilla, William accused of shutting out Sussexes. Public sympathy swelled, and for the first time in months, Harry wasn't the villain. He was the son left out in the cold. And here's where it turns again. Because just as the narrative began tipping in Harry's favor, a leak occurred. A British tabloid published an anonymous source claiming that Harry was planning to fly to London without an invitation. The headline? Harry plots surprise palace visit amidst King's health crisis. The reaction? Panic. Was he really coming? Would Meghan join? Would Charles even allow it? The palace scrambled. Security was reviewed. Backdoor options were discussed. But ultimately, Harry didn't come. He didn't need to. The message had been sent. Loud, clear, and deeply destabilizing. Because now, three truths were undeniable. Charles was unwell, and the palace was hiding the severity. William had challenged the system and was pushing for transition. Harry, once exiled, now held the power to blow it all open. And through it all, Camilla watched and planned, because the Queen Consort had just received a message of her own. A dossier, confidential, unmarked, with 3 words scrawled on the front in red ink. Diana's final letter. What it contained would ignite a firestorm the crown never saw coming. What do you say when the truth can no longer hide behind the gold-plated gates? What happens when silence becomes more dangerous than confession? Because despite all the spin, all the suppression, and all the whispered cover-ups, there comes a moment in every royal crisis where the curtain has to lift. And when it finally did, the world gasped. Not because of what was said, but because of what it didn't say. Let's go inside the palace. To the moment Buckingham released the statement that shook a nation. And then ask, was this the beginning of transparency, or just another masterclass in control? It happened on a Thursday. Cloudy skies hung low over London. The type of day where the city felt heavier, slower. Royal watchers had already noticed Charles's absence from multiple state events. 3 cancellations in 10 days. A diplomatic reception postponed without reschedule. No video messages. No social media updates. Even the official portrait on the royal website had quietly changed, zoomed in, slightly softened, subtly aged. The silence was deafening. Until 10:07 a.m. That's when phones buzzed. Media inboxes pinged. And Buckingham Palace's press office published an official update titled simply, "A message regarding His Majesty's health." It was 134 words long, and it hit the nation like a thunderclap. Here's what it said verbatim. Following recent consultations with His Majesty's medical team, it has been advised that the King reduce his public engagements in the coming months to allow for continued health assessments and preventative care. His Majesty remains in good spirits and continues to manage constitutional matters privately. The royal family appreciates the public's understanding and support during this time. No further comment will be made at this stage. That was it. No diagnosis. No timeline. No acknowledgement of the rumors already spreading across every corner of the media landscape. It was like watching a fire consume a building, while the fire chief calmly insists the smoke is decorative. But the reaction? Immediate, explosive, uncontrollable. Within minutes, hashtag King Charles trended globally on Twitter. Google searches for Charles illness, King cancer, abdication rumors, and is Charles dying surged across Europe and North America. And then came the headlines. The king steps back. Palace admits to health crisis. The Guardian. Reduced duties, rising questions. The Times. Monarchy in crisis mode. The Washington Post. But perhaps the most telling headline came from a tabloid that had long towed the palace line. No diagnosis, no comfort, no truth. That line cut through the fog like a dagger. Because this wasn't a clarification. It was a warning. The palace was not ready to talk. Not honestly. Not yet. Inside the media sphere, royal correspondents scrambled to interpret what wasn't said. What does preventative care mean? Could be routine. Could be chemotherapy. Could be palliative. What about constitutional matters privately? Suggests mental clarity, but contradicts reports of lapses and withdrawn meetings. And no further comment. That's the red flag. That means they're buying time. The public wasn't reassured. They were unnerved. Because this wasn't Queen Elizabeth's stoic dignity. This was Charles vanishing. And then came the viral moment. That same evening, ITV's News at 10 aired a brief 8-second clip from a recent charity event. Charles, walking slowly beside Camilla, is seen turning to greet a child holding flowers. He leans in to speak, and visibly forgets the child's name. Camilla intervenes, smiles, corrects him gently, leads him forward. To the untrained eye, it's nothing. To a nation on edge, it was confirmation. The king wasn't well. And the palace's statement wasn't protecting him. It was protecting itself. Now here's the twist. That clip was leaked. It wasn't part of the official broadcast package. It wasn't cleared by the royal media liaison. It came from a freelance camera operator who had filmed secondary angles for press reels. Someone inside the machine had made a choice. Let the people see. And that leak? It cracked the palace's strategy wide open. Within 24 hours, petitions began circulating online demanding full transparency from the monarchy regarding the king's medical condition. A group of constitutional scholars published a joint op-ed in the Telegraph titled, "The Crown Must Not Be Shrouded in Secrecy." And then Parliament entered the conversation. A Liberal Democrat MP submitted a formal inquiry requesting clarity on the line of succession, should the king become medically unfit to reign. It was an unprecedented move. Not because of its legality, but because of its timing. The public statement had backfired. In trying to calm the storm, the palace had confirmed its existence. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Harry was watching. And for the first time in weeks, he stayed silent. No interviews, no leaks, no Instagram quotes or cryptic podcast mentions. Sources close to him say he was deeply shaken by the statement and saw in it the coded confirmation he'd feared all along. His team quietly halted any further press outreach regarding his own documentary project, because now, this was no longer about family drama. This was about legacy, mortality, power, and the crown. Back in London, Camilla made her move. 2 days after the palace statement, she appeared alone at a women's shelter in East London. She shook hands, laughed gently, and, in a brief moment caught by a reporter's boom mic, said the words that would headline papers across the UK. "He's doing his best." That's all we can ask. It was human. It was honest. And it wasn't in the palace script. Some called it compassion. Others called it strategy. But whatever it was, it worked. Public support for Camilla surged by 12% in a single week. And with that one off-script sentence, she became the monarchy's voice of reassurance. Not Charles. Not William. Camilla. And William? He wasn't pleased. Insiders say he saw the statement as a compromise. An attempt by this secret council to delay his proposed transition plan. His team felt blindsided by the lack of detail. They feared the damage to public trust. And they believed the Camilla moment was choreographed. But William didn't respond with a press conference. He responded with silence. Strategic silence. Because while the palace scrambled to contain the damage, William was already working on a different kind of message. One that wouldn't come from a press office or palace email. One that would come directly from Charles himself. You see, buried in the statement's vague wording was one line that hadn't been cleared by the standard communication protocols. The phrase "constitutional matters privately." That was a red flag for insiders, because it implied Charles was still signing off on government appointments, briefings, and military matters. But here's the catch. He wasn't. At least, not all of them. A leak from inside Whitehall revealed that certain briefings had been deferred, that William had already begun attending Privy Council meetings, that royal protocol was being bent quietly, discreetly, and increasingly. And that could only mean one thing. A regency was being considered. Now pause. What does that mean? A regency is a constitutional mechanism where another royal, typically the heir, acts on behalf of the monarch due to incapacity. It's not abdication. It's not a coup. It's a stopgap. And the last time it was seriously considered? King George III. Over 200 years ago. For it to even be whispered now? That tells you how grave the situation truly is. And yet, Charles refused to acknowledge it. But something shifted. Because 1 week after the public statement, an unconfirmed report emerged. Charles had recorded a private video message. Unreleased. Unscripted. Personal. To be aired only if his condition worsened. Or if he could no longer speak for himself. The contents of the video remained tightly guarded. But one line has allegedly been confirmed by 2 separate sources. The strength of the monarchy lies not in the crown I wear, but in the hands I pass it to. A quiet surrender. A foreshadowing. And a truth the palace could no longer deny. Because the statement that was supposed to reassure the public did the opposite. It didn't protect the king's legacy. It exposed its fragility. It didn't halt the speculation. It legitimized it. And now, as the nation began bracing for what came next, one figure loomed larger than anyone anticipated. Not William, not Camilla, not Harry, but a woman whose shadow still haunts the throne. Diana. Because just as the country began questioning the present king's fate, a letter from the past emerged. A letter written in 1995, and what it revealed would blow the monarchy into uncharted waters. They tried to contain it. They redacted names, blocked access, threatened legal action. But like every tightly sealed vault in the digital age, eventually, something cracked. And when it did, the truth didn't trickle out. It detonated. A confidential document. A medical file. Marked eyes only. And somehow, it ended up in the hands of someone who had nothing to lose and everything to reveal. Because if the palace wouldn't give the public answers, someone else would. Let's rewind to the moment the leak happened. And how one file shattered the myth of control forever. It began with a ping. A quiet upload to an encrypted European whistleblower site known for publishing state secrets, court documents, and internal medical data. No title. No context. Just one PDF. And one chilling file name. Windsor_protocol_CBD report_final. CBD. Corticobasal degeneration. The same condition rumored for weeks, but never confirmed. Journalists scrambled to verify. Royal aides denied its existence. The palace refused comment. But it was too late. The file spread like wildfire. Within hours, it had been downloaded thousands of times. And what it contained was devastating. Let's break it down. The document was 17 pages long, dated 6 weeks prior to the palace's vague health statement, stamped with the insignia of a leading Harley Street neurology clinic, and signed, allegedly, by one of the UK's top consultants in degenerative brain disease. Inside were detailed notes, medical terminology, cognitive assessments, and, crucially, behavioral observations. The most explosive excerpts? Let's quote them directly. Patient displays intermittent speech irregularities, left-hand tremors, and reduced executive function under stress. Incidents of microseizures observed during prolonged conversation. Diagnosis: corticobasal degeneration, progressive and presently incurable. And finally, recommended: reduction in public engagement, cognitive therapy, and preparation for delegation of constitutional duties. There it was, in black and white. A confirmation the palace refused to provide. A diagnosis they had tried to cloak in soft language and ceremonial distractions. And now, it was out, for the world to see. But the real bombshell wasn't just the diagnosis. It was what came after it. Because on page 13, buried in a section titled Implications, was this line. It is medically advised that long-term public-facing responsibilities, particularly those involving high cognitive strain, e.g., addresses, state meetings, privy council duties, be transitioned to a